Do you think that our privacy is dead? Should we log into outside services using Facebook or Google? Should we use voice assistants at home? Should we put tape on our laptop's camera? Should we turn off the mic on a phone because Facebook and Instagram are always listening? Thank you so much for coming, and for everyone here that we're joined by Professor at McMaster University and Tony Porter. Is that correct? And we'll discuss a lot of things about data or data. Which one is right?
Either one.
Either one. Okay, I will probably then use them interchangeably.
Sure.
And we'll talk a lot about data and cybersecurity and laws around that as well. So, kind of the first question: do you have social media platforms?
Myself?
Yes.
I'm on Facebook, and that's about it.
That's about it. Yeah. That's weird that it's interesting that you name Facebook out of all of them. Okay, that's cool. And then I will just ask it right away. Do you think that our privacy is dead?
Well, there's still some zones of privacy, and it's pretty important to try to keep those. It's an ongoing contestation between the desire of the social media platforms to have as much access as possible to data and our concern about that. Mm-hmm. So the law is continually changing, and when consumers get angry about their loss of privacy, then it's possible to push back. So it's not like the game's entirely over, thankfully.
Okay.
And in fact, there's been some important recent developments.
To which end are we closer? To being dead, or the patient is dead, or more dead or more alive right now?
I would say the patient is on the operating table, and there's some serious interventions going on.
Can you name, please, a couple of recent examples why we got on the operating table?
Sure. Well, I think it's been developing over a number of years, and people have been especially alerted to the risks in the last few years. The social media companies like Facebook, Google, and then the platforms like Amazon and Netflix as well have been accumulating large volumes of data about individuals, and it's gradually being integrated more and more. And then in some countries, there's additional sources of information which have been integrated together to provide even a more comprehensive picture of each individual. For many years, that was operating behind the scenes, and most people weren't really aware of it. But the 2016 U.S. presidential election really brought it to people's consciousness because of the use of that data to potentially throw the election to Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And since then, there's been other uses of social media data in elections.
Mm-hmm. For example, which one?
Well, the Philippines is one well-known case where Facebook was heavily involved with Duterte's election. He's an authoritarian leader who manipulated the Facebook fake news issue in a way that...
Close to same as America, what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, the difference is that in the Philippines, there's also death squads that are active, and so the consequences are more deadly than in the United States.
Okay.
And then in the most recent Brazilian election with Bolsonaro, there was a heavy use by him as well of Facebook and other social media to manipulate the news and in ways that helped him get elected.
So if I can summarize, so the main reason why we're on our operating table right now with our privacy is because we realize that you can use social media platforms to interfere into elections. Is that fair?
Well, that's one of the things that's made it most prominent. I mean, I think there's lots of other concerns about the privacy issue.
For example, can you give like another one or two?
Well, one is just what does it mean for this information to be available to employers? So increasingly, employers use the data that is accumulated for making employment decisions, and people are anxious about their past social media history in that regard. There's been concerns about this data getting integrated with credit scoring. So if you this is particularly a problem in the United States, where a lot of people have been exposed to bankruptcy because of health costs.
Oh, okay.
And then what does it mean if you're applying for a job and your employer finds that you're behind on your loan payments and doesn't give you the job as a result?
And because why would the employer do that?
Because they'd have access to your credit scores, which are another source of big data that's being accumulated and integrated by data brokers. And then, your credit score could be brought into an employment decision.
Okay, I see. And then I would like to give you like two examples of when I was researching of something that actually blew me away in terms of how companies use data. And if you have any other cool examples, I would really appreciate if you share. So, for example, one that actually blew me away is Uber, and that they know when your battery life is lower than 10%. And because they know that, they will charge you higher prices based on that. They know that you're in a rush to order right now to get in a car as fast as possible. So they're like, hey, here we go, higher price. Do you know any other cool examples of like where companies can like use data that they're accumulating in real life to make more profits, basically?
Well, I mean, in general, ads are of course targeted, but also prices are adjusted based on the platform's assessment of your income and other factors. So there's concern about the fairness of that, and whether there's even a market in that type of situation, because the idea of a market is there's supposed to be competition between people offering you things. But if the companies that are offering them have such a sophisticated knowledge of what you're willing to pay, or whether you're a priority customer or not. I mean, that's another issue, whether you get bumped to the top of the line when you call in to lodge a complaint or something.
And they can know that?
Yes.
For what?
Well, they have a record of all your transactions with the company. And so they have algorithms that can immediately alert the person at the call center whether you are a favored customer or not, and then or the software can immediately direct you more quickly to the customer service center to get a quick response or not.
Canada Post, why do you hate me so much? Let's try to establish capabilities of big data. Is it possible to look only at my history, like online? Is it possible to make a portrait of Vlad without knowing me whatsoever? Is it possible right now?
For anyone to do that?
Just not for, let's say, companies, or like for I'm not talking if I can do a portrait of you rather than if it's a government can use, a government can do that, or a corporation.
Well, it depends on, for sure it depends on the actor. Like, so government, especially the US government, has tremendous access to knowledge about everybody. And we don't know exactly how much knowledge they have. When Snowden revealed the National Security Agency's working with the platforms to accumulate information, it was pretty frightening, because there hadn't been so much awareness that the U.S. intelligence agencies were accumulating data from the social media platforms. So if you consider the access they have to phone data and everything else, they probably could have a pretty complete picture of you. I think when people start getting worried about this, there's also a limit on the amount of time they can devote to individuals. So it's unlikely they would do that unless they had some algorithm that was telling them that they should. But that's worrying too, because people often get flagged for strange purposes that are not accurate.
For what do you mean by that?
Well, that's become an issue on airline access to airlines. So people have been put on the no-fly list because their names happen to match up with somebody else's names.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's been cases of infants not being allowed on because they've been on the suspect list, and
Fun.
I had to get off of it.
I mean, infants are pretty scary. But can you actually clarify something? You just said it so you said U.S. government can create somewhat digital version of me if they really want. How does it work? I don't think I ever used once. I used internet once in U.S. So, for example, all the data that accumulated in Canada, they can access. Like, who owns? That's like a big question. Like, who owns the data? That, like, my data, is it Canadian government, Canadian Facebook, US government, US Facebook? Like, I certainly do not own it. It's not even a question, but who does?
Well, that's been a big issue, and some people would argue that you should have more ownership over your own data, and are campaigning for that. But at the moment, most of us give up our data freely when we click the terms of service agreements on the websites we visit and so on. So that's a really important issue. I mean, a lot of the social media that we use, and even some of the sort of corporate services that we use that aren't social media, are stored on the cloud. And so where's the cloud? I mean, the cloud is basically a bunch of servers that are spread around the world. And often they're not in Canada. It's actually been a really big issue because some people want to keep their data outside of the United States because the U.S. Patriot Act gives the U.S. authorities a lot of access to data on the cloud. So some people specify that they want to keep their data in Canada when they're dealing with a corporate, service provider. But the major media companies move data around pretty freely.
Across the world.
Yeah. I mean, in Europe, there's really strong data protection laws. And so they have signed various agreements with the U.S. social media companies that allow them to move some of that data out of Europe on condition that they respect the European rules about data privacy. And when that breaks down, as it did a year or so ago, it creates real problems because then suddenly the social media companies can't move the data out of Europe. And it's really important to them to be able to aggregate it all and, do an analysis without worrying about the borders.
Yeah.
But for Canada, there's, like, for instance, at McMaster, should the data that we collect be made available on a server that's in the United States, there's a lot of things we wouldn't want to do that with, like student records that might have sensitive information. So,
but then let's say with everything that you talk, especially the distinction between Europe and North America is, like, as you just acknowledged, there's a significant difference. So let's say for me personally, I use Facebook and so all social medias, and there's a very good digital profile between me and Canada because friends. I moved to, let's say I go to Europe for a month. Will my ads be as targeted in Europe, in England, let's say, as they're in North America? Or because I'm right now in England, now it's a blank. I've never been there, they don't have my data, so they're still learning about it. Or everything that the world, the cloud, knows about me in Canada, they will know in England as well.
They should know most of what they know in Canada, also in England. Even when you access Google or Gmail here, the server is likely to be in the United States. So the data is already available worldwide. But there are differences. So, for instance, I just was in the United States and I accessed Netflix, and they immediately knew that I was in the United States, and they provided the US Netflix. But they still had all the data about what shows I had watched in Canada. So there's a kind of complicated, calculation that they do that hopefully takes into account the rules about data privacy and adjusts what you see and what they use based on that.
And what if they don't? Let's say if they don't, what's the worst case scenario if they don't take that into consideration?
Well, it can become a scandal. I mean, there's a worst case for the individual and a worst case for the social media company. That,
let's say for social media, I get it. Like you don't get profits, you get a massive scandal. People are upset. For individual, what if if they don't care, the corporation don't care what's in there for me?
Well, those data protection rules are there for you to try to protect your privacy, and people will really vary in how much they care about that. In Europe, there's a big concern that's been enacted into law about past events interfering with people's ability to get beyond them. So if you commit a crime and then it's posted on the internet, should you be able to have the right to have it removed from the internet? There's a lot of controversy about that.
What do you think? Should it be allowed? What's your opinion on that?
I think probably not, because the argument against it is that it sort of erases the factual record of what happened. So it's true that it makes it harder for people to get beyond their pasts if it's all recorded there. But if you go to jail, for instance, then lots of people do manage to get beyond that by serving their time and doing good works afterwards.
Let's talk a bit about the biggest scandal for past. There's election, but we still don't that's not for sure. We have Cambridge Analytica. When Cambridge Analytica happened, were you surprised?
Yes, that was surprising, the extent of the whole scandal. I mean, there was particulars of the use of that data in the election, and then everything it revealed about how Facebook was working and so on.
So before the Cambridge Analytica scandal happened, you because you do that, you study that on a academic level. You didn't know that this is what's going on. In the, I want to say community at large didn't know.
I think there was an awareness that there was a risk attached to all the use of data and the availability of it. But I think the extent to which the researchers got access to everybody's data was not clear before. It was pretty shocking when it became visible. And it didn't even become visible immediately. It was after all the sort of inquiries into it.
Yeah. And for everyone who doesn't know, so to summarize, the researchers got a whole bunch of data, access to a whole bunch of data through academic purposes that was sold in its return to Cambridge Analytica, a digital marketing firm, and they were able to use that data to target ads very specifically. Did they help Trump? Do you know that? No?
Well, there's a lot of debate about how likely they were to have influenced the election, or even tipped it over so that Trump won instead of Clinton. And there were other efforts to manipulate the election, like the Russian bots that were really active, and all the disinformation that was spread as a result of Russian, efforts. So it's pretty hard to assess the total number of people who received disinformation, not just from the Cambridge Analytica targeting, but from everything else, was in the millions. So it's likely that the whole effort had a significant impact on the election, and it's certainly possible that it tipped the balance. But there's, the counter argument to that is that not everybody believes everything they see, and so if they got strange ads, they may have discounted them. Right. Really hard to measure that type of thing.
And do you think that Facebook and Cambridge Analytica scandal related to Facebook, do you think it's an isolated incident, or it's just it's a bigger problem and Facebook was exposed here?
I think it's a much bigger problem, and it's not just in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. There's a lot of concern in Canada as well, and the government has taken certain measures to try to prevent such a thing happening in upcoming elections.
And what did they do?
Well, there was a bill passed last December Bill C-76, which tries to tighten up the controls over fake news, so-called fake
news. How they can control that, though?
It's fairly recent, so people are just sort of digesting some of the parts of this. But for example, it was quite hard to prosecute cases where people used fake identities and engaged in fraudulent activity that could be considered fraudulent. So the Commissioner of Canada Elections has a lot more power to issue orders compelling witnesses to answer questions about that type of thing. It makes it now an offense to make a false statement during an election, alleging that a political leader or candidate.
So what is it? Online specifically?
Yeah. No, actually not only online, but if the statements are false about place of birth or claiming that a politician has broken a law when that's false, it's now illegal to do that.
Kind of the last aspect here, I would like to just quickly touch on the future. What country does currently lead the data race? What country collects the most data right now? What do you think?
There's collection of data by businesses, and there's collection of government data by businesses. By government as well. And I would imagine that by far the largest accumulation of data is in the United States. It's probably no question about that, because the major platforms are American, and the U.S. government also has by far the greatest surveillance capacity of any government in the world.
Do you think that China can challenge them on that?
There's the intensity of surveillance that varies across countries, as well as the quantity of data that's being accumulated. So China has a really amazing and frightening capacity to collect data that is not yet at its at the place that they want it to be, but the social credit system that they're putting in place is building on the connections that the government is establishing with the Chinese counterparts to Facebook and Google. And one of the things that has really been quite surprising is to people who were looking at the internet, say 10 or 20 years ago, is how effective the Chinese authorities have been at creating a China-specific internet. And that includes the Great Firewall that, separates China from the rest of the world, but also the ability to use surveillance and connect into the social media.
Because they're not just collecting data online. They connected, like I read that they have 170 million cameras in the country that they collect, just not online, but even physically. And there was like a fascinating example. I believe he is an engineer from Australia who's working in Beijing or something like that. And he jaywalked a street and got a fine 20 seconds later on his phone.
Wow. Yeah.
Because of how fast they can just scan your face and identify the right person, identify your WeChat, which is a platform that they all pay with, send you a bill, and it's like, here you go.
Yeah. No, it's really frightening. And the mobile payments are really well advanced in China as well. So the records of financial transactions when you buy anything, be integrated along with all the data that the government would collect through its own systems, administrative tax systems, everything else. So one of the goals of this system is to be able to give everybody a score which could integrate their political loyalty to the party and the system with their performance on repaying debt, their employment records, their purchases, and there's a lot of controls over where you can live in China, whether you can live in a city, and that's your credit score is beginning to have an impact on your ability and what job you can get. So it's a kind of dystopian vision of future that we see similar tendencies here, but it's far more advanced in China.
Can you name that? Because is there any Western countries that, of course, not doing that to that extent, but not somewhat, but close, or tendencies at least? Can you name a few and what they're doing?
Well, it's present in all of what we've been talking about, that this data can get integrated in a way that can cause problems for individuals. So, as I mentioned before, if you're deemed to be a preferred customer as a result of the identity the digital identity that's being constructed of you that follows you around, then you're going to get preferential service. So it's beginning to create access that's freer for some people and not for others. Same with the no-fly list. You can fly or you can't, depending on whether you're on that list. Same with the employment decisions. A lot of review of job applications is done digitally now, not by humans. And, to the degree that the job assessment is integrated with data about your credit history or social media, it's not dissimilar to the discrimination that China's beginning to develop. It's just at a whole different scale, thankfully.
In this last one, I think this is great. So here's the last part. I would like to run a couple of points from you, and it's a question, and then I want you to answer, kind of give an advice. Should we do it or shouldn't we do it? And if we should, what's the consequences and why? And we can kind of run with that. And so, should we log into outside services using Facebook or Google?
Well, it just depends on how much you care about your privacy and your data. An even bigger question is, how much should you be using Facebook at all if you're concerned about the use of data? So I think if you're using it, then you can, decide how much you want to extend your use to, different applications that are available.
Okay. Okay. Should we use voice assistants at home?
Well, I don't really, I'm not familiar with the details of how the tracking works enough to be able to sort of assess the difference between that and a phone call.
Fair. Should we put tape on our laptop's camera?
Well, I think lots of people, we don't really know exactly what's, available or being used. So again, it partly comes down to how much you care about whether your image.
Does it help to put a laptop?
I think nobody knows for sure, but I think if you want to be safe, it's not a bad idea.
Okay. Should we use messengers with double encryption code, like Telegram, for example?
I think it's a good idea if you're concerned about your privacy.
Okay. Should we turn off the mic on a phone because Facebook and Instagram are always listening?
I think that's unlikely. They're always listening, but I think that, again, there's other people like government actors who might.
Okay. Oh, okay. Hello, Kazakhstan KGB services. Should we use Chinese technology products like Huawei?
That's a really difficult question, and it's been a huge controversy in Canada and the other major countries. The Canadian government is in the process of trying to figure out the answer to that question.
Okay.
My own guess is that the controversy is partly motivated by commercial competition between the U.S. and China, partly by genuine security concerns about the Chinese government's ability to access the back doors on the digital 5G network that's being constructed. I think probably there's some middle point where the technology can be used for some parts of the 5G network, but that other parts, it would be best not to use their technology.
Okay. Should we reread Orwell 1984?
Not a bad idea.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you very much for coming.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.